Hi everyone, I am just going to give it one more minute to allow some people to join, but I suppose anyone who has already joined, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. You're very, very welcome to this session today, which is basically going to be a whistle-stop tour on neurodiversity in the workplace, just kind of really touching on the high level of I suppose neurodiversity in general, what that means, the various different conditions and identities that fall under neurodiversity, and how I suppose these identities interact with someone's time as an employee in the workplace, and I suppose what companies can do to I suppose make the workplace a more inclusive and more conducive to retention place, I guess, for people who are neurodivergent. There is a little chat box here. I'm sure this might be many people's first time on Demio, so just a bit of housekeeping. If you want to leave any comments or questions throughout the presentation, you're very much welcome to. There's just a little chat box there. It should be to your right, I think. So if you want to say hi, if you want to ask me anything, if you just want to leave a comment, or maybe you have some experiences of your own you'd like to share, by all means, feel free to leave them in the chat box. I'm going to fire ahead with the presentation, but we'll probably have time to circle back for questions at the end. So if you have anything you'd like to add or anything you'd like to ask, by all means, drop that in the chat box and we'll come back to it at the end. But I think we'll actually kick off. I know it's only 1 minute past, but we do have quite a bit to get through. It's a really broad topic, and I couldn't possibly hope to cover everything in just one little session. So I am going to try my best though to kind of give you just a little kind of high level overview on neurodiversity in the workplace. So I think we'll get going with that. So just a quick introduction to myself. I'm Melissa Mooney. I am Rangam's project coordinator for the EMEA region. You can probably tell from my accent, I'm based in Ireland, and I identify myself as autistic, ADHD and dyspraxic. So I'm extremely neurodivergent. So hopefully I can, I suppose, bring some of my own personal experiences, both as an employee and as someone who's currently working in the neurodiversity space, into this presentation today to hopefully give you some more, I suppose, insight on what this all looks like in practice. So with that, I will move on. Just, I suppose, as a little precursor to this discussion, I think it's really important to, I suppose, before we start, just frame neurodiversity in the broader, I suppose, context of diversity and inclusion, because obviously diversity and inclusion is a big buzzword at the moment, and we don't always necessarily associate neurodiversity with it, even though it's coming more and more into the overall conversation. But I suppose one thing that's just really good to be mindful of is that no one person is just one thing at any given time. We have so many different identities that are always just constantly interacting and intersecting with each other. Like, for example, I'm Irish, I'm autistic, I'm dyspraxic, I'm a woman. There are so many different facets to who I am, and those things interact with each other all the time. Like, being an autistic woman in Ireland is different to being an autistic woman in the UK. Being an autistic man in Ireland is different to being an autistic woman in Ireland. Being a white autistic person is quite different to being a black autistic person. Being LGBT as an autistic person is quite different to being a straight autistic person. We all come at these discussions from different angles and different viewpoints. And it's just really, I suppose, important to remember that we all come to this discussion with different perspectives that are informed by these differences and commonalities that we have. And none of these things ever exist in a vacuum. So just something I wanted to kind of, I suppose, begin the discussion with before we dive into neurodiversity in general. So I suppose, first off, don't want to presume any pre-existing knowledge of neurodiversity. This, like I said, this is a complete kind of crash course for assuming that you know nothing about neurodiversity. There are no stupid questions here. If there's any questions you want to ask as I'm going along, or if maybe I didn't explain a particular term, please drop it into the chat box and I'm happy to explain. But essentially, I just wanted to clear up a few words I will be using throughout the presentation before we properly get going. So neurodiversity, it's in the title of the presentation. Essentially, it's quite simply just a concept of, in the same way that like someone can be left-handed or right-handed, or someone can have blue eyes or brown eyes, or someone can have blonde hair, black hair, brown hair, having a different brains and different ways of thinking is just a normal and really natural part of human variation. And it's not something that we need to be worried about. It's not something we should see as inherently negative. It's just something that's there. It's just another trait of who we are. In the same way that, like, you know, I have blue eyes, I'm blonde, I'm tall, I'm Irish, I'm left-handed. I'm also autistic, and I also have a neurodivergent brain in the same way that someone else can have a neurotypical brain. So it's just part of natural human diversity, and that's kind of, it's in the name, neuro, brain, diversity, diverse. So I suppose this, just to give a bit of history to this term, this was coined by Judy Singer in the late 90s, who was this amazing woman who, I suppose, saw the way that autism was being discussed in particular in the media at the time, and it was quite medicalized, and it was very much, I suppose, looking for a cure, or seeing autism as this like inherently negative thing that we need to kind of tone down or lessen. And she was looking at these discussions and thinking, I don't really identify with that. I think that actually this is just, we need a new way of thinking about people who think differently. And it needs to be more kind of just centered around what we call the social model of disability, which is that disabilities don't need to be cured, they don't need to be medicalized, we don't need to talk about it in such an inherently negative way, like it's something we need to get rid of. It's something that we need to embrace and see as a regular part of human diversity. So that's where neurodiversity comes from as a concept. It's relatively new. It's been here since the late 90s, but it's something we firmly believe in here at Rangam, as opposed to, I suppose, the medical model that was prevailing up until, say, the late 90s, early 2000s. You will also hear me say neurotypical and neurodivergent quite a bit, probably, throughout the presentation. Neurodivergent just means that you have a neurodiverse condition. So it could be autism, it could be ADHD, it could be dyspraxia, dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia. We'll get into it a bit later, but that's what neurodivergent means. It means you have one of those conditions that falls under that umbrella. And neurotypical means you don't have one of those conditions, or you don't identify with having one of those conditions. So I kind of explained a bit about that already. So why we came up with the concept of neurodiversity and emphasizing not so much the medical side of things, but more the social side of things. And here's the neurodiversity umbrella. Like I mentioned, there's a few different kind of conditions or identities that sort of fall under this. I identify with quite a few of these myself. Like I said, I'm autistic, I have ADHD, I have dyspraxia, and there's also dysgraphia, Tourette's. A lot of people don't realize sometimes that mental health conditions also fall under the neurodiversity umbrella, but that is true. It's to do with brain chemistry and brain differences. So that is also part of the neurodiversity umbrella, and it's something we don't often discuss in that context. So that's just something interesting to note. So the autism spectrum, I suppose autism is kind of the first thing we think of when we're thinking about neurodiversity. It's very kind of in the public zeitgeist at the moment when it comes to particularly, I suppose, neurodivergent hiring. But I suppose it's something that's really difficult to define, but because no two autistic people are the same, there's massive variance from one person to another. You're never going to meet two autistic people who have the same combination of traits, but I suppose there are a few traits that tend to unite most autistic people, but not everyone. And a lot of those things are centered around sensory differences. For example, this is, I suppose, being particularly sensitive to particular sights, particular sounds, particular tastes, touch. To give you a few examples, like I'm really sensitive to sound. Like I have a very sharp sense of hearing. I can hear things that other people can't hear at all. There are particular sounds that really annoy me and really like are actually painful for my ears. I can't stand the sound of our tumble dryer in the house and things like that. I'm very sensitive to background noise. If there's people chattering in the background, I find it really difficult to concentrate. For other people, though, it could be something like that doesn't disturb me at all, which could be like fluorescent lights. It could be particular smells. It could be like a co-worker's perfume, or it could be a co-worker at your desk eating their lunch, and the smell of the lunch is just really just distressing for you, and just because you're so sensitive to it. And even tactile, so particular touches that are just, I suppose, like really difficult for you. I know, for example, I have a lot of sensitivity around temperature. Even this morning before I logged onto this call, I was too hot, too cold, too hot, too cold. I'm like the Goldilocks of temperature, and it can be pretty it can be pretty tricky. But one of the great things about working from home is I can change my clothes as often as I want. Often people will see about 3 different outfit changes from me throughout the day, but as I go from call to call, which is quite, I suppose, amusing for the rest of the team. But it's because I'm so sensitive to temperature. You can also be sensitive to like particular feels, so how like a particular fabric feels. I know that a lot of autistic people struggle with how, I suppose, the type of clothes you might expect someone to wear in a professional setting might feel. Like, for example, men who wear suits to, I suppose, interviews and things like that. I know a lot of autistic men really struggle with wearing suits. But I suppose they're just like a few examples. But like a big thing for autistic people is, I suppose, the whole sensory piece. A lot of autistic people will also have kind of very specific, very deep interests that they do deep dives into. And this can be really helpful from actually from a work perspective, because often a lot of autistic people are working in an area that is their special interest. For some autistic people, like programming or computer science could be their special interest, and they're working as a programmer. Or your special interest could be even autism itself, and you're working in this area in the DEI space. And obviously that's amazing for productivity and is a great skill to have in a worker. So sometimes special interests can be played to someone's advantage in a workplace setting, and show someone's ability to hyper-focus and really get jobs done quite efficiently. A lot of autistic people have, I suppose I should explain actually what stimming even means. Stimming is basically a repetitive behavior that someone does to kind of self-regulate or self-soothe in a situation where they're overstimulated. And this can be, something like, I suppose, a bit more overt, like, I suppose, rocking back and forth, or I don't know, flapping your hands, or, it even could be a stim toy. Some people have these toys that they like to stretch and things like that. They're specifically for stimming. They're made for autistic people and they're great. I don't use them myself, but I know a lot of autistic people who do and find them really helpful. But it can also be something that's a bit less obvious. Like for me, I have like a Palo Santo stick, which is like this kind of fragrant type of wood. And I like smell it every now and then to, I suppose, calm myself in a situation where I'm a bit stressed. A lot of autistic people have stimming behaviors that might look like fidgeting, like they could be rubbing their leg. They could be, I know I run my hands through my hair a lot and it looks like fidgeting, and some people might find that annoying, but I suppose just it's good to be aware that autistic people often need to do those behaviors to like calm themselves, and they might even realize they're doing it because it's so natural to them. But it's good to be aware of that, that people aren't doing it just to be annoying sometimes. A lot of autistic people are going to have different ways of communicating as well. Like even as I'm presenting here, you might notice that sometimes I blank in the middle of sentences, and that's to do with my working memory. Autistic people can be quite direct, quite literal. Sometimes, if there's someone in your place of work who maybe skips past the small talk and always wants to get straight down to business, it might not be that they're this killjoy and they're just trying to be rude. It might just not have occurred to them that people would want to talk about their weekends maybe for a few minutes, or I don't know, like their personal lives. That just might not have occurred to them. And, maybe the prospect of having to answer a question like, how are you, which is like the most difficult question ever for an autistic person to answer, because we expect that you're meant to give an honest answer. And sometimes, you know, if you're not feeling great and you say that, people look at you strangely, because I suppose the whole social script is to say, how are you? I'm good, thanks. And you? Yes, I'm good. And then we move on. That can be quite stressful, quite confusing, and I suppose quite anxiety inducing. So sometimes autistic people are quite keen to move past that and kind of get straight to whatever the meeting is about. So if anyone in your workplace does that, it mightn't necessarily be out of rudeness. It might just be that small talk makes them uncomfortable and they just kind of want to move past it. So that's just another thing worth bearing in mind. One thing that I actually quite struggle with, even to this day as an adult, is eye contact. You know, they say the eyes are the gateway to the soul, and, you know, I've no trouble believing that, because, you know, it almost feels too intimate. It's like looking at someone naked, and, you know, it's actually quite uncomfortable to the point of being a bit painful sometimes. So I suppose one thing that's really helped me in that regard is being able to work from home, because you know, like when you're on a Teams call, no, it's hard to tell when someone's making eye contact. You can kind of just look wherever you want on the screen, and nobody can tell who or what you're looking at. That's really helped me to find just one spot that I can look at and kind of stick to it without having to actually look right at people, because I find it really hard to keep what's in my mind, like in terms of what I want to say, while having to look at people. So it's great to have one less thing to have to focus on. And I suppose autistic people can also be quite routine oriented. And this is because the world around us is often quite unpredictable, quite chaotic. And, you know, it's nice to have rules. It's nice to have structure in a world that sometimes can be hard for us autistic people to understand. So this means that, I suppose, when a change happens, particularly an abrupt one, it can be really difficult for autistic people to cope with that, especially if there isn't a transition period or if it isn't really communicated clearly. So that's why it's really important that if there are any organizational changes, maybe any personnel changes, any structural changes, no matter how small you think they might be, that this is clearly explained to your autistic colleagues, and that you maybe have a plan in place as to how to navigate this change, and, you know, to be able to offer some support to your colleague as they adjust to any changes that happen in the workplace. Because of course, change is a normal part of life and a natural part of life. We don't expect you to just never change anything ever, but it is good when you, I suppose, give as much notice as you possibly can and allow people time to process and adjust to the change. And that goes for anyone, even if you're not autistic. As I said, no two autistic people are the same. We all have unique sets of traits. What works for one autistic person isn't necessarily going to work for another. So it's really important that you listen to the individual access needs of each autistic person that's in your workplace. So I suppose just a few examples though, like, again, any one of these might work for one autistic person, might drive another autistic person crazy. So this is by no means an exhaustive list, but for example, like flexible or remote working, that's quite a game changer for a lot of autistic people because they're in control of their sensory environment. I know that it's been a massive game changer for me. I don't have background noise. I don't have, like, I suppose, other conversations happening around me in an open plan office when I'm trying to kind of focus on my work. I can kind of structure my day in a way that will make me most productive. Yeah, I feel like there's, I tend to be able to just kind of function better at home because everything's predictable. There's no kind of unwanted sounds, smells, tastes, things coming in that are unpredictable. I'm able to kind of get more order and routine onto my day when it's in an environment that I have complete control over. So that's been great for me. If you are in an office, sometimes it's a good idea to give an autistic person a designated seat, especially if there's a hot desking policy, because some autistic people just like to sit in a particular part of the office or I suppose not even just like to, kind of need to, both for a routine and also because maybe there's a particular part of the office that has fewer, I suppose, sensory disturbances than other parts. Maybe there's a particular part of the office that's like near a photocopier that an autistic person would very much want to stay away from because the noise distracts them and things like that. Or maybe there's a part that kind of faces away from the office or looks out a window and I suppose might be less distracting. So that's worth thinking about as well. Giving clear instructions is a massive one, particularly in writing. Sometimes when I'm hearing someone give me instructions verbally, I can't even process half of it because I'm still processing the first step and they're already on step 5, and I'm also a very slow writer because I have dyspraxia. So written instructions for me is a must when it comes to adaptations. Otherwise, I end up doing the task incorrectly the first time, have to go back and do it again. So, it's actually in, I suppose, the team's best interest sometimes to give written instructions so there's no opportunity for misunderstanding and that every single step is there and captured. And it also helps the manager make sense of the task themselves by having to write it down. Sometimes you're kind of like, oh, wait, when I explained that to them verbally, it didn't actually make sense. Now that I'm having to write it down myself, I realized that this actually maybe doesn't make sense. So written instructions is a great idea. Try to avoid using corporate jargon, using too many acronyms. I suppose using overly complicated sentences. It's not that we don't understand complicated sentences, just sometimes it's easier to process if we put things in the simplest terms possible. I know sometimes I even do this myself where I maybe make things more complicated than they need to be, but sometimes it's just easier to process when we try to break things down to be as simple as possible. Having some understanding around different communication styles. So, like I said, people sometimes have to have patience with me because I have really poor working memory and I struggle to keep sentences in my head. So sometimes I will stop mid-sentence, or sometimes I find it hard to speak up in a conversation because I find it really hard to know when there's a gap in the conversation and when is a good time to speak up. Like right now I'm blanking a bit, but yeah, sometimes it's good to have some understanding, some patience around the ways people might communicate. Like I said, clear communication of organizational changes. And this is a bit of a novel one, but this is one that I find works for me, having one camera off day a week. So one day where you're allowed to have your camera off for all your meetings. It's obviously great to be able to see people's faces and everything. I wouldn't suggest doing this all the time, but just having one day where you don't have to be so hyper conscious of your facial expressions and making sure that you're not looking, I suppose, a lot of people tell me that my concentration face makes me look like I'm actually really bored when it's the opposite. I'm trying to focus as much as possible. And I find I get very hyper aware of my facial expressions and making sure that they match my emotions and things like that as an autistic person. So having one day where I don't have to think about that just really helps in terms of taking some strain off me. So they're just some examples, but another, I'm not going to get into any other conditions this morning because we just don't have time, but another very common one that we hear a lot about these days is ADHD. And to be honest, there is an awful lot of overlap between ADHD and autism. All of these traits that are listed here could also be something that an autistic person identifies with. So ADHD, I suppose, mostly is about things like executive function, and that impacts your ability to do particular tasks like planning things. Multitasking can be quite difficult. I know I really struggle to do multiple tasks at the same time. I really need to just focus on one thing at a time and then the next thing and then the next thing. As opposed to switching between tasks, I find that quite difficult. But I do find because I'm able to get into a state of what we call hyperfocus, which you can see listed there, which is this really deep state of focus where it's like an earthquake could happen and I wouldn't notice because I'm that deeply focused. It means I get tasks done really quickly, really efficiently, and I'm able to move on to the next one really quickly. So that actually balances out my difficulties with multitasking. It doesn't make me any less productive. I just get there in a different way. Working memory, like I said, that's kind of your ability to retain things in your head while also kind of listening to what the next thing that someone's saying at the same time. It's almost like multitasking, but with your memory. I really struggle with that. That's why I suppose written instructions, as I said, is really, I suppose, imperative for a lot of neurodivergent people, because it can just be really difficult to retain things in your head long enough to take it down. Impulse control. So I suppose some ADHD people might want, I suppose, to jump headlong into tasks straight away without, I suppose, sitting down to read the instructions and, I suppose, make sense of the task first. So sometimes it's good to sit down with the ADHD employee and basically ensure that everyone understands the task, is clear in every step, and has a clear plan. It kind of ties in with the whole planning difficulties that some ADHD people might have. And also emotional regulation. Again, a lot of neurodivergent people have what we call spiky profiles. So we can be very up, very down, and sometimes it's hard to get that just right. So that's just another thing to be mindful of, that I suppose ADHD people might get burnt out quite quickly and might get I suppose, into an extreme state of exhaustion. And it's really important that ADHD people are getting their movement breaks and are taking, I suppose, regular leave as well, just to kind of store up the energy, because we can burn out quicker than a lot of people, especially if we don't have the right supports in place. Just some examples of things that can help when you have ADHD in the workplace. Providing clear to-do lists for any tasks that you're delegating to an ADHD employee. Using organizational tools, like I use OneNote and add my to-do list there. I also have a planner in Microsoft Teams with a task bar. Just really helps me keep organized with my tasks, because sometimes I can just forget about things. Providing clear deadlines, so not just, I suppose, saying, oh, do this whenever you have time. The more clarity you can give, the better with any neurodivergent person, not just ADHD. Having movement breaks is quite important. I know I really have to have my movement breaks. So that means, like, for every, I suppose, 2 hours I work, I need to have at least, 10 minutes, I suppose 5 at a squeeze, where I can just, it could literally just be, I walk to one end of the house, come back to my desk. I just need to step away. I often find when I finish a task, I actually have to physically remove myself. I have to, get up, walk somewhere, walk back again. And that allows me some sense of removal, I suppose, before going on to the next task. So that's just something really important to think about, particularly for people with, I suppose, the hyperactive element of ADHD, because not everyone, I suppose, identifies with the hyperactive element, but I certainly do. Wearing noise cancelling headphones is something that can really help with, I suppose, distractions in the background, because, like many ADHD people, I really struggle with getting distracted and with my background things happening. You can also, on Outlook, schedule focus time. And I really have to do that in order to get tasks done between meetings, because otherwise my calendar fills up with meetings. And there isn't a long enough stretch, because I need to block off a proper kind of 2-hour block or whatever to do a task. I can't just do them in little half-hour pieces between meetings. I need a proper run at it. So blocking off the focus time to allow yourself to get into that state of hyper-focus is sometimes, an absolute godsend when you're neurodivergent. And I suppose checking in a bit more frequently. It doesn't have to be a meeting. It could be like a simple Teams message, like, hi, how are you doing? Is there anything I can help with? Do you understand everything you need to do? Is there anything I can clarify for you? It could be as simple as that. It doesn't take 5 seconds, and it's really simple adaptation that can work for any neurodivergent person, really. I've sort of shared a lot of my own experiences already, so I'm probably going to skip over that because we're already getting close to time. But I do kind of want to finish on, why should neurodiversity be on your DEI agenda? And not only why should it be there, why should it be close to the top of your DEI agenda? Frankly, the unemployment stats for neurodivergent people in the UK and Ireland is really, really dismal at the moment, and it really shouldn't be. 80% of neurodivergent people in the UK are unemployed or underemployed. And in Ireland, it's 85%. And it's not for any lack of ability to do the job. It's from simple barriers in the recruitment process, in, I suppose, maybe the work culture that means people don't feel supported enough to stay. 1 in 5 of the world's population, as it says there, are believed to be neurodivergent. And that means you probably already have neurodivergent employees, whether you realize it or not. And they mightn't even realize too, because they mightn't be diagnosed. So, that is a huge amount of the workforce that you may be unconsciously alienating if you don't make your workplaces as inclusive and as accessible as possible. And obviously, with the Great Resignation, which I know is sort of maybe waning off a bit now, but is still very much ongoing, we're seeing, huge amount of people kind of reconsidering what is important to them in the workplace. And there actually is a survey that says 99% of millennials and Gen Zs report that an employer's inclusivity and accessibility is top of their wish list. So it really is, I suppose, not just the right thing to do, but also just makes good business sense to have this, I suppose, diversity of thought, particularly when it comes to innovation. For a lot of neurodivergent people, thinking outside the box is kind of our default state of being. So, there's so many positives that come with neurodiversity, and the negatives aren't even negatives. Like, the negatives only exist in an environment where you're not supported, and supports are really easy to implement. So, as you can see here, look, I suppose the stereotypical view of autistic people or neurodivergent people is that we're like coding geniuses, or else we just can't do anything, which both of those stereotypes are quite unrepresentative of autistic people, and in the latter case, just frankly untrue. You can see we're very detail oriented. We can get into a state of hyper focus. We're quite observational. We notice things other people won't. We're very loyal to employers. If we find one that works for us, we're much more likely to stay, which is great for retention. And we tend to have quite deep knowledge of subjects that interest us. That's just one of many. There's so many, I suppose, traits that are associated with neurodiversity that are absolute assets to employers. So really, it's a no-brainer. As you can see here, fosters diversity of thought, promotes authenticity and empathy, boosts team morale, and different approaches to work, innovation, and creativity. What's not to like? So I suppose, how can you make a difference with neurodiversity in the workplace? There are quite a few different ways of getting involved. We can help you and your company start a neurodiversity hiring program. So you can just get in touch with us. I'm Melissa, MELISSA at Rangam.com if you want to know more. You can refer any neurodivergent friends and family to us as candidates, and we can help link them to inclusive job opportunities. We can provide some career guidance and networking opportunities, or you can, I suppose, as the employer for people with disabilities. You can join your employer's ERG, so that's an employee resource group. If you don't have one, start one. And you could try to be a peer buddy. And that could just literally just be a friend in the workplace, someone that a neurodivergent person can come to and talk about maybe some issues they've been having without judgment. So I suppose this is just super high level. I'm sorry, I really rushed through that. I hope it made sense. But if you want to know more, or you'd like to go and do a proper deep dive on a particular topic that's talked about today, or maybe wasn't talked about, please do book a training session with us. My email address is right up there. So yeah, get in touch if you'd like to, I suppose, arrange a session. We'd be happy to do so and talk about any topic of your choosing. So I suppose with that, I'm gone a bit over. So I think I will wrap up. I don't see any questions, but my email address is there. If you want to come up with me any questions afterwards, feel free to. But have a lovely day, and thank you so much for coming.